Today, I'll be talking about the issues and misconceptions regarding the most basic of physical findings. What is a normal heart rate? That is, the number of times per minute that your heart contracts, pushes blood through the body, and generates a pulse. Now, if you're thinking, everyone knows it's 60 to 100, what's the big deal? Well, you may be right that everyone knows it, but the problem is that everyone is also wrong. When talking about what constitutes a normal heart rate, there are a couple things I need to clarify. First, I'm referring to a normal resting heart rate. The resting heart rate is the rate you experience when you've been sitting or lying still for several minutes with no significant physical activity beyond breathing. At the other end of the heart rate spectrum does exist something called the maximum predicted heart rate, which, as the name implies, is the fastest rate your heart can achieve during the most strenuous activity your body can perform. The commonly cited equation for predicting the maximum heart rate of a person is 220 minus their age in years. Unfortunately, while it's simple to remember and even more simple to apply, most exercise physiologists feel it's too inaccurate, and there have been many attempts to better refine it. But for today, we'll be focusing on the heart rate at rest. The next thing to clarify is the age of the person we're talking about. Just as age impacts the maximum predicted rate, it also impacts the resting rate. Specifically, children have faster rates than adults, and infants have faster rates than children. In fact, the age at which the resting heart rate is the fastest, 9 to 10 weeks after conception, when the average rate tops out at around 170 to 180 beats per minute. Over the next several weeks, the rate slows down just a little until settling out somewhere between 120 and 160. But unless you're an obstetrician or a neonatologist, you won't need to worry about fetal heart rates. So for the rest of the video, I'm going to focus just on the normal resting rate in adults. Since there are so many adults in the world to examine and to study, and since the heart rate or the pulse is arguably the most fundamental and basic of all physical exam findings, you might assume that there's already a consensus about it. In fact, there's actually a very strong consensus among major physical exam textbooks, among guides to ECG interpretation, and among instructors in medical and nursing schools. That consensus is that the normal resting heart rate in adults is between 60 and 100 beats per minute. Any rate below 60 is considered to be a bradycardia, which is literally Greek for slow heart. Any rate above 100 is considered to be a tachycardia, which of course means fast heart. This 60 to 100 consensus is so strong that I've honestly never heard a member of a medical school faculty, excluding cardiologists, teach to the contrary. So what's the problem? Well, there's three of them. The first problem is the evidence. The largest relevant study was performed in 2007, when investigators sought to remeasure and potentially redefine the normal values for a number of aspects of resting electrocardiograms, or ECGs. This included the duration of certain waveforms, the average directionality of the electrical potential vector, which is called the QRS axis, and yes, the heart rate. Their study subjects included 44,000 adults who had been identified as having very low probability of cardiovascular disease. So what did they find? The median adult heart rate, which isn't exactly the same as average heart rate, was 67, with 96% of the subjects falling between 48 and 96. There was an extremely slight gender difference in that women's rates were 1 to 2 points higher than men's. These findings of a slower and slightly broader range of normal, as well as a gender difference, were consistent with previous smaller studies. The second problem is expert opinion. In my own personal experience, every cardiologist I've ever talked to about this issue has voiced the opinion that 60 to 100 is too high, particularly the lower bound of 60. In 1992, a survey was sent to 150 prominent cardiologists asking a simple question. should the limits of a conventionally defined normal heart rate be changed from 60 to 100 to instead 50 to 90? Should it remain the same, or should a different range be used? 136 cardiologists responded. Of those, 123, or 90%, agreed with a proposal of 50 to 90, 6 voiced preference of 50 to 100, and only 2 preferred the traditional range. And the remaining 5 had a variety of responses, all of which were slower. Additional evidence of expert opinion on this issue comes from critical care medicine. In 1992, a consensus committee from the American College of Chest Physicians and the Society of Critical Care Medicine sought to establish uniform definitions of sepsis and the systemic inflammatory response syndrome, or SIRS. For consistency, this committee described SIRS and sepsis as states in which at least 2 of the following physiologic derangements were present: fever or hypothermia, heart rate above 90, respiratory rate above 20, and either leukocytosis or leukopenia. Although it's not explicitly described in the consensus statement, why would they have set the heart rate cutoff at 90 if they believed the normal range to extend above this? It's logical to conclude that the committee also felt that 90 was the upper limit of normal. The last problem with the traditional range of 60 to 100 is its history. Where exactly did this range come from originally? Well, it goes back to the earliest days of electrocardiography. In 1928, the New York Heart Association published their first edition of Nomenclature and Criteria for Diagnosis of Diseases of the Heart. In this book, they defined something called, quote, regular sinus rhythm as a heart rhythm originating from a structure in the right atrium called the sinus node, from where it normally originates, and as having a rate between 60 and 100 beats per minute. But 1928 was decades before any formal study was conducted into the normal distribution of heart rates in the population. So how and why could the New York Heart Association come up with such a range? Well, it was put by Charles Kosman, an early member of that group. It was for, quote, the purposes of standardizing electrocardiographic nomenclature. These limits and terminology are used principally for convenience and uniformity of designation. They do not define normality except in a gross way. However, in 1943, that same New York Heart Association renamed regular sinus rhythm as normal sinus rhythm, a decision which may have been responsible for creating this whole misconception to begin with. And if that didn't feel arbitrary enough, consider why the specific range of 60 to 100 was the one chosen for standardization. Standard electrocardiograms are printed on graph paper, which is divided into large boxes, 5 millimeters on a side, which are then further subdivided into 25 smaller boxes, 1 millimeter on a side. It's the large boxes that we're interested in. The ECGs are printed out at a rate of 25 millimeters per second. Therefore, along the x-axis, each large box of 5 millimeters represents 1/5 of a second, or 200 milliseconds. This has been standard convention since before electrocardiography was really introduced commonly into clinical practice. As a consequence of this convention, an interesting trick for quickly estimating heart rate becomes apparent. The heart rate is equal to the number of large boxes between successive spikes, known as QRS complexes, divided into 300. So if there are 2 large boxes between each QRS complex, the rate is 300 divided by 2, or 150 beats per minute. If there are 4 large boxes between each QRS complex, the rate is 300 divided by 4, or 75 beats per minute. How this becomes relevant to our 60 to 100 range is that when one is trying to determine if something is normal sinus rhythm or a tachycardia, that is a rate that's too fast, if we use 100 as our cutoff, one only needs to see if the number of large boxes separating complexes is more or less than 3. More than 3, the patient has normal sinus rhythm. Less than 3, the patient has a tachycardia. That can be determined by inspection instantaneously. However, if we use 90 as our cutoff, we would need to see if the number of large boxes separating complexes was more or less than 3.33. A little more awkward and not quite as automatic. So in essence, the decision to make the upper bound of a normal sinus rhythm at 100 was because it allowed for a trivially easier time interpreting ECGs. And even this ridiculous reason has been made obsolete by the use of ECG machines, which now automatically calculate the rate with extremely high reliability. So the traditionally taught range for normal heart rate is not supported by evidence, it's not supported by expert opinion, and originates from a completely arbitrary quirk in how ECGs are recorded. There's just one more issue to consider. That is, what do we even mean by the word normal when we discuss the normal heart rate? Are we referring to the statistical average in the general population? Or are we referring to the statistical average only in those patients who are known or suspected to have no cardiovascular disease? Or are we referring to a heart rate that will minimize chance of future cardiovascular disease? Put more simply, does normal mean typical or does normal mean healthy? A 1990 study looked at the association between heart rate and mortality in 1,800 patients who were admitted to the hospital with a heart attack. This graph here shows the patient's mortality in the first year after the heart attack as a function of their final recorded heart rate immediately prior to hospital discharge. We see that the mortality for heart rates of 50 through 89 are uniform, but once the rate at discharge creeps above 90, mortality starts to climb pretty rapidly. But the danger of faster heart rates isn't limited to just patients who've had heart attacks. In a study of 56,000 patients without known heart disease, the faster the resting heart rate, the increased risk of a major adverse cardiovascular event such as a heart attack or cardiac arrest. And this trend persisted even after statistical adjustments were made to account for the presence of high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, smoking, obesity, and lung disease. So even if one believes that resting heart rates of 90 to 100 are statistically within 2 standard deviations of average, which they probably aren't, they don't seem to be markers of good health. So going back to our original question, what is a normal heart rate? Well, it depends on who your patient is and what you mean by normal, but it's probably not 60 to 100. Thanks for watching my experiment in a new video style on this channel. Please let me know what you think of it in the comments. Keep in mind that if I continue to make some videos in this style, they'll be occasionally mixed in with my typical med-ed material and will not be displacing it. And if you're new to my channel, and this is the first video of mine you've seen, welcome. Please don't forget to subscribe, and that way you won't miss out on any of the videos to come.
Hi guys, my name is Sanjay Gupta. I'm a consultant cardiologist in York. Today I wanted to talk to you about heart rhythm disturbances, and in particular I wanted to try and explain what is it that makes a heart rhythm disturbance dangerous. Because by far and away the thing that scares everyone is that heart rhythm disturbances can be dangerous, and the problem is compounded by the fact that there are so many different types of heart rhythm disturbances. They all have horrible names and very difficult names, and there's a lot of jargon, and no one really knows, is this dangerous? You have PVCs, PACs, atrial tachycardia, atrial flutter, atrial fibrillation, SVT, ventricular tachycardia, non-sustained ventricular tachycardia, and wherever you look, you think, oh, this could be dangerous, this could be dangerous, this could be dangerous. So I thought I would try and explain it in a way that is easy to understand, and try and break it down into basics to help you understand what the relevance of any heart rhythm disturbance is and what is it that makes that heart rhythm disturbance dangerous. Okay, so the first thing to understand is that the only relevance of any heart rhythm disturbance, the thing that a heart rhythm disturbance indicates is that for the duration of that rhythm disturbance, the heart is not working as efficiently as it should. It's as simple as that. That's all it means. So the heart is a pump, and the role of this pump is to pump oxygen-rich blood around to our vital organs. And of course, if the heart becomes inefficient, then it will pump less blood around to our vital organs. And of course, if there is a prolonged, if that is very inefficient and there is a prolonged duration of inefficiency, then you could cause damage. You could cause damage to our vital organs. You could cause damage to our heart as well, because our heart is one of those vital organs. So the first thing to understand is that that's all the relevance of any heart rhythm disturbances. The second thing then to say is, well, what is it, that makes the heart, what is it about the heart rhythm disturbance which tells you how inefficient that heart rhythm disturbance is? And the truth is this, that the first thing to understand is that for a heart rhythm disturbance to be dangerous, to cause you damage, it has to be sustained. It has to go on for a certain duration of time, because if it is very transient, it is not going to be enough to cause damage. Okay, remember, what do we do with our lungs? Our lungs are responsible for getting oxygen in, and they oxygenate our blood, and the blood goes round. So if our lungs aren't working, for example, then you would have the same problem. You would get less oxygen in and you could cause damage. But we all know that you have to go a certain duration of time without oxygen to cause damage. Transient inefficiencies, such as, for example, when we swim, we hold our breath. We don't do ourselves any damage by that. It has to go on for a prolonged period of time to cause damage. So the first thing to understand is that non-sustained rhythm disturbances that don't go on for a prolonged period of time, for more than 30 seconds, are not going to be dangerous. All right. So if you have ectopics, those by definition are not going to cause you any damage, because they are so transient. You're just being inefficient for that one beat, and then it's followed by a normal beat. So any non-sustained heart rhythm disturbance is by definition not going to cause you any damage. And this also applies for things like NSVT, non-sustained ventricular tachycardia. It is non-sustained. Because it is non-sustained, the inefficiency is non-sustained and therefore will not cause you any damage. So the first thing is, non-sustained rhythms do not cause us any damage. Sustained rhythms, sustained inefficiency is more interesting, all right? And the duration of the sustained inefficiency is very interesting. So if you have sustained inefficiency for an hour, that is not going to be as dangerous to us as, say, sustained inefficiency for 3 days. So that's the second thing to understand. The third thing to understand is the heart rate is important, because the faster the heart rate during the rhythm disturbance, the more inefficient the heart. Why? Because the heart needs a certain amount of time to fill with blood, and if the heart is going very fast, it's not getting the time to fill with blood, and therefore less blood is coming out just because the heart is fast. Couple that with the inefficiency of a heart rhythm disturbance makes it more interesting. So someone who has so let's say ventricular tachycardia at 110 beats per minute is not going to be in danger compared to someone who has ventricular tachycardia at 200 beats per minute, because A, they have the inefficiency from the rhythm disturbance, B, the fast heart rate compounds that inefficiency. The third thing that has an impact on our inefficiency is where the rhythm arises from. Okay, so atrial rhythms generally pump more blood out of the heart compared to ventricular rhythms. So that is why atrial tachycardia is not as inefficient and is so much better tolerated than ventricular tachycardia, because by very nature, if it's just the ventricle that's pumping the blood out, you're only getting the ventricular bit pushing the blood out. The ventricle is doing the work. If you have it atrial rhythm, the atria is pushing blood into the ventricle and helping the ventricle push the blood out. So your ventricle is filling with more blood because the atria is pumping into the ventricle, and that's pushing the blood out, so you're getting more blood out. So that is why atrial rhythms are less inefficient compared to ventricular rhythms. And finally, the most important thing is do you have a heart which is already inefficient to start off with before you develop the rhythm disturbance? So if you have a damaged heart, if you have a heart that is only working at 20%, you then add in a sustained heart rhythm disturbance, which goes on for several hours, which is ventricular, which is really fast. There we're talking about a dangerous rhythm. But otherwise, if you have a non-sustained rhythm, it's not dangerous. If you have a rhythm which is atrial as opposed to ventricular, it's not going to be as dangerous. If you have a rhythm which goes slow, it's not going at 130 beats per minute, that's not going to be as dangerous as a rhythm that is going at 200 beats per minute. And finally, if you have a structurally normal heart, then because the heart is strong, whatever inefficiency is happening because of the rhythm disturbance, at least the heart is a strong structure and therefore does pump some blood out. Yes, it won't pump out as much because of the inefficiency from the rhythm, but it's still able to pump something out. If the heart is already weak and on top of that you add in the inefficiency, then the heart is going to pump out a lot less, and that inefficiency is dangerous. So when people contact me and say, oh, I've got ectopics, are they dangerous? Of course they're not dangerous. I have non-sustained VT. Is that dangerous? No, it's not dangerous at all, because non-sustained VT is non-sustained. The inefficiency is not sustained. It is not going to do us any harm. Sustained rhythms, which are ventricular, which are very fast, which are on the background of an already damaged heart, those are the rhythms that are dangerous. So I hope this helps you understand what makes a heart rhythm dangerous, and it makes you realize that actually, you have to have a lot of things, a lot of bad things for a heart rhythm disturbance to be dangerous, as opposed to just the odd ectopic here or a little run of non-sustained VT or something like that. So I hope this was helpful. I would love to hear what you thought of this video, and I hope this makes sense. And if I could do things better, please let me know. Other than that, I'm really grateful for everything you do. I'm sorry I haven't put a video out for a while, but I will do another one. And I think my next one is going to be on Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome. So thank you so much, and all the best. Take care. My name is Sanjay Gupta. I'm a consultant cardiologist in York. Today I wanted to do a video on the subject of caffeine and its effects on the heart. Now, there is a perception amongst healthcare professionals and patients that the ingestion of caffeine can trigger off heart rhythm disturbances. And this leads to an almost universal recommendation whenever a patient goes to their doctor with palpitations. In this video, I wanted to look at what evidence is out there to support this recommendation. The first thing to say is caffeine is a stimulant. It is found in a variety of different concentrations in many commercially available beverages. These include coffee, tea, green tea, black tea, soda, so Coca-Cola, that kind of thing, and also energy drinks. To give you an idea, a 375 ml can of Coca-Cola would probably contain about 32 milligrams of caffeine. A cup of green tea would contain about 35 milligrams of caffeine. A cup of coffee would probably contain about 95 milligrams of caffeine. An espresso shot would probably contain about 106 milligrams of caffeine. And a lot of energy drinks can contain up to 500 milligrams of caffeine. Caffeine has a half-life of 5.7 hours. It reaches maximum concentrations within an hour of consumption. And it is nearly 100% bioavailable, so everything you drink gets into your system. Caffeine has four main effects on our heart. Okay, two of them can be pro-arrhythmic, can trigger off heart rhythm disturbance, and two of these effects can actually be anti-dysrhythmic, which means reduce the chances of heart rhythm disturbances. And I'll go through them one by one. The first thing is that caffeine has a sympathomimetic effect, meaning that it causes sympathetic activation. It causes our flight or fright response to build up. If you give someone 250 milligrams of caffeine, their adrenaline levels will go up by about 207%. Their noradrenaline levels will go up by 75%. At very, very high doses, caffeine is pro-arrhythmic, and this has been shown in rat models where rats were fed very, very high concentrations of caffeine, and they developed arrhythmias, and they actually developed ventricular fibrillation and died. So certainly in rat models, it seems that very high levels of caffeine can be very dangerous. Another effect that caffeine has is that it increases the amount of calcium within our cells. It increases our heart rate by both its sympathetic activation and also by increasing the levels of calcium within our cells. So those are two of the causes by which caffeine can be pro-arrhythmic, can trigger off heart rhythm disturbances. However, caffeine has an inhibitory effect on our adenosine receptors. So we have adenosine receptors within the heart. Adenosine itself can trigger things like atrial fibrillation. So caffeine, because it inhibits these adenosine receptors, actually could possibly have an antiarrhythmic effect as well. Finally, caffeine is an antioxidant. Antioxidants can sometimes be very helpful in reducing heart rhythm, heart muscle irritability. So those are two things. That's effects on the adenosine receptor and the fact that it's an antioxidant. They both have anti-dysrhythmic effects. The sympathetic activation and the increase in the amount of calcium can both make it pro-arrhythmic. So I'm going to talk about the different heart rhythm disturbances to try and see if there's any evidence which has been shown to tell us what effect caffeine has on heart rhythm disturbances. What does the research tell us? So if we look at atrial dysrhythmias, these are atrial tachycardia, atrial ectopy, atrial fibrillation. Lab-based experimental studies have failed to show a consistent relationship between caffeine and the development of atrial dysrhythmias or the inducibility of atrial dysrhythmias. Population studies have actually shown that you get a reduction in the amount of atrial fibrillation with ingestion of caffeine. There was one interesting study in which they looked at 57,000 patients or participants, and they found that those people who drank coffee actually had a lower incidence of atrial fibrillation. So very interesting. There have been about 11 major studies. They've studied around almost 350,000 participants, and only in one very small study was it found that coffee was actually detrimental to atrial dysrhythmias, which is again really interesting and points to this antioxidant effect and the effect it has on adenosine receptors. In 3 studies of these 11 studies, it was shown that actually coffee reduced atrial dysrhythmias. In the rest, there was no real benefit or harm. It's worth noting that what we get from studies may not necessarily apply to the individual patient, because I recently put a poll on my Facebook page asking patients who had atrial fibrillation. I said, look, do you find that coffee is a trigger for atrial fibrillation? I got about 600 answers, and 45% of patients said yes, coffee did trigger off the atrial fibrillation. So that's again interesting. What we read in publications may not necessarily apply to the individual, which is again really interesting. And I think that if the patient has noticed a temporal relationship, a close temporal relationship between coffee and heart palpitations, then it's obviously best to avoid drinking the coffee or caffeine, irrespective of what the research shows. Because, why do you want the symptoms? What about ventricular dysrhythmias? What is the effect of coffee on ventricular dysrhythmias? And there is really, again, no good evidence which points to the fact that coffee increases ventricular dysrhythmias like ventricular ectopy, ventricular tachycardia, etc. There have been almost 5 placebo-controlled studies, again small studies, which have shown that even drinking up to 6 cups of coffee per day didn't seem to trigger off heart rhythm disturbances coming from the ventricle. So again, really interesting. There are some very old small studies which suggested that if you drank more than 9 cups of coffee a day, then there was a propensity to having more ventricular dysrhythmias. But in moderate quantities, coffee doesn't seem to trigger off ventricular dysrhythmias, as the research suggests. So what about tea? Tea also contains caffeine. Tea contains less caffeine than coffee. The question really that I wanted to try and look into was, does tea increase the risk of heart rhythm disturbances? Tea contains, as I say, less caffeine, but is rich in something called EGCG. EGCG stands for something called epigallocatechinate gallate. I have no idea, but this is what EGCG stands for. And this compound has anti-inflammatory effects. In fact, they gave a bunch of rabbits this compound, and they found those rabbits got less AF compared to rabbits who weren't given this compound. There have been some studies, small case-controlled studies, that the ingestion of green tea in particular is actually beneficial for episodes of AF. It reduces AF and it also reduces ventricular dysrhythmias. There was one study where they looked at all the studies to do with tea, and they found that if you drank 3 cups of tea a day, green tea a day, there was a lower risk of cardiac death. So that's again interesting. Finally, what about energy drinks? Now, energy drinks, as I say, contain so much more caffeine than coffee or anything else. The problem with energy drinks is that they have a lot of other energy boosting substances. So they will have sugar, they'll have ephedra, they'll have guarana, they'll have yohimbine. And therefore, there's a much higher risk of causing heart rhythm disturbances. Energy drinks are often taken with alcohol, they're taken with illicit drugs, and this makes for a very unhealthy combination. There are lots of case reports now coming out that the ingestion of energy drinks increases heart rhythm disturbances, increases ectopics, increases the presence of atrial fibrillation, supraventricular tachycardia, and even ventricular tachycardia. In fact, 75% of patients who have had more than 2 energy drinks in a day will complain of palpitations compared to those who've had less than 2 energy drinks in a day. In addition, it's worth knowing that that energy drinks have been associated with prolongation of the QTC interval. Remember, when the QTC interval goes up, there's a much higher risk of heart rhythm disturbances and very dangerous heart rhythm disturbances. There's some note that energy drinks can unmask conditions like the Brugada syndrome, again, a potentially very, very dangerous lethal condition. We also are beginning to see that energy drinks can actually trigger off a procoagulable state, so they can actually increase the clotting of the body, promoting blood clots, and that again points to this real worry about energy drinks. So in summary, what I would say is that it appears that coffee is probably okay in moderate quantities. Tea is probably beneficial in moderate quantities. The energy drinks are probably harmful even in moderate quantities. So I think the first thing to say again is I would highly recommend that you pay attention to your own triggers and you say that, okay, well, if I do this, this happens, so I'm not going to do it. When it comes to energy drinks, I definitely don't recommend them because of the risks associated with them and because evidence is still just beginning to accrue. So 10 years down the line, we may find that they're far more harmful than we thought. So I hope you found this useful. The message is everything in moderation, including moderation itself. Thank you so much for all that you do for me. All the best.